Hello and welcome to Exotic Gardening UK, Yorkshire Kris Weekly. And on this week's episode, we'll be looking at how fast do palm trees grow in the UK. So in this episode, we're going to look at various palm trees at various sizes and talk about how quickly or how slowly they grow in the UK climate. And obviously in this location, we're looking at the north of England in Wakefield in Yorkshire, but this will apply across the country and to many other locations around the world with a similar sort of climate. And we'll be looking mainly at Trachycarpus palms, but we'll also touch on the other palms like Chimops, Butias and Jubaeas as well. So here we have a very nice specimen of Trachycarpus fortunei. This one here, you can see it's got a nice stout trunk, and it's got a good trunk that I would say is about 6 foot tall before the crown develops up here. And this has been in the ground for about 8 years now. And it was planted with a trunk no bigger than sort of a foot and a half. So it's grown about 5 foot of trunk, or 1.50 meters, in about 7-8 years. And this is a well-established plant now that flowers each year, produces masses of healthy green leaves, nice and sturdy in the ground, gets enough water, gets enough feed from the other plants around it as well. So it's well looked after, it's in pretty much direct sun, so it's in pretty much ideal conditions for growing. And this is how quick it's grown in my garden. But I'll show you some other Trachycarpus fortunei around the garden that have been planted as long as this, but look rather different. Now behind me is by far my tallest Trachycarpus fortunei. And this was planted pretty much one of the first plants we planted in this border. So this has been in this location for 8 full years in the ground now, and it was planted with a trunk about 30-40 centimeters. It had the first sort of decent sized trunk on it, so it wasn't a pencil thin, it wasn't just leaves coming out of the ground with the starting of a trunk. It had the proper width of a start of a trunk when this was planted out 8-9 years ago. And now if I walk right under it, I'll get to the base and we can see, I lift this leaf up, you can see me, so I am about 2 meters tall with these boots on. That's up to about there, and we go another good 50-60 centimeters of trunk. So it's a good, it's about 2.5 meters tall of trunk. So that's just over 8 foot. And it's got then the leaves another good sort of metre or so above that as well. So this is a big substantial plant now. So it's grown that, like I said, in about 8-9 years, and it's not quite a foot a year, but it's getting close to that. So that's how quickly it's grown in my garden. This is in decent shade as well, so yes, it gets a lot of sun now, but when it was smaller it was in more shade. So that's a big plant, and eventually it will carry on growing up and up, but then eventually it will slow down in growth when it gets to its maximum or near its maximum height. We've still got a long way to go yet. Now I've shown you a few different Trachycarpus palms, and here is another one. This is not a rare slow growing palm, and it's also not one that I've just planted. Believe it or not, this is a Trachycarpus fortunei with it hasn't got any true trunk yet, and this was planted 9 years ago. Now look at the size of this. It's absolutely tiny for its age, and the reason it's so small is because it's in dappled shade and it's competing with all sorts of other plants. We've got ivy ground cover growing around it, we've got bamboo over there as well, and in that bamboo we've got another small Trachycarpus fortunei, and we've got a cordyline, and it's just probably not had enough water because the conifer hedge on the other side here as well, and it's just very small plant. So it is not a slow growing plant, Trachycarpus fortunei, but if you don't put it in good growing conditions, it can grow incredibly slowly. Now this is a healthy plant, it's nice and green, and it's sturdy. It's got good roots on that, 'cause it's not flopping over the plant, it's not suffering from basal canker or anything like that. But it is not growing fast because it's in this partial shade and it's got other plants around it. So if you are wanting your palm to grow at a good rate, at the rates you read about on the internet and in books, up to a foot a year for Trachycarpus fortunei, you need to plant it where it's not getting outcompeted by other plants that are taking away nutrients that you might be applying to the area. So you often see people growing these in lawns really close, like grass right up to the trunk of plants. That really slows down the growth of palm trees because the grass gets to the food before the palm tree does, and it's a similar sort of situation here. So this is a 9-year-old Trachycarpus fortunei, and like I said, it hasn't got a trunk yet, it's literally an inch or two, and the overall height on these leaves from the ground is about 40-50 centimeters, if that. So it just goes to show, if you want maximum growth or a decent growth rate, plant a palm tree in conditions away from other plants. And here we have my biggest Jubea chilensis palm. I have 2 of these. I have one in the front garden and this one in the back garden. And like I said, I've been growing palms now for well over 10 years. This one I've had for over 10 years, but it's been in the ground now exactly 9 years. And in that time, what's happened is it's slowly got wider. So the girth of the trunk is wider than when I first planted it. It's got on some height as well. So we've moved from this sort of height, it was about 50 centimeters, and now it's sort of a good 80-90 centimeters to the top there to spear. But what you'd call, it's hard to define the exact trunk, but if you'd say it's grown a good 20 or so centimeters, maybe 30 centimeters of trunk, and the leaves I got much longer. So when I first planted it, it was about 5 foot really to where the sort of top of the leaves were coming out. But now it's closer to sort of, like I said, about 5.5-6 foot where the leaves are coming out, and the leaves themselves are much bigger, and that is because it's got its roots in. It was in a pot to begin with, obviously, and now it's got its roots really far down in this raised bed, and it's in maximum sunlight again. It gets fed every year. It's not watered in the summer at all, so it just relies on the natural rainfall. And then it's got these wonderful arching feather leaves, and I think it's a really healthy palm, and I think it's grown as good as it can do in my location. But as you can see, this is 9 years growth from already a decent sized palm. It's not absolutely huge compared to some other palms that grow much taller, like the Trachycarpus fortunei. This really is sort of put on bulk rather than height. And then the one in the front garden is also put on quite a lot of size, because that was in a dustbin. It was planted in sort of like a 4 foot deep dustbin into the ground 5 years ago from a relatively small plant, and now it's bulked up a bit, and I think this year we're going to see much bigger leaves, and over the next 2 or 3 years it will bulk up, and I would say in about 5-10 years it'll be looking like what this plant looked like 10 years ago. And this is the smaller Jubea, like I mentioned, planted out from a dustbin 5-6 years ago in the front garden, and now it's starting to get to a decent sized plant, and it will really cover this area. It's already covering quite a large area, but over the next 5-10 years it will really bulk up. So I'm in the bottom of the garden in a square bed where it's mainly composed of palm trees, and there's also big Tetrapanax rex here as well, which is just getting into growth, but we're concentrating on the palm trees. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 Trachycarpus princeps hybrids. And for those that have been watching my videos for years, you might remember the palm fertilizer experiment where we had 10 identical palm trees, very small, grown in pots, and they were given different fertilisers, and we looked how the growth rate and their root development went over a season. Well, these are 4 of that original 10, and if you remember, they were only small plants, sort of pencil thick trunks, only, you know, starting trunks in, I think they were 3 to 5 litre pots at the time, and these have been planted out in this location from that size for about 6 years now. And as you can see, we've got 1, 2, one close to the camera, there's one to my right and one bit further behind that you probably can't see on camera, and they've all grown roughly at the same rate, which is to be expected because they've got the same pretty much growing conditions in the same bed, and they were planted out at the same size. So they've gone from something with hardly any real trunk, you know, just something like 30 centimetres tall, into plants now that are about 1 metre 50 tall, and they have trunks that I would say are about 2 foot tall, so about 60 centimetres, maybe 70 centimetres, and they have grown really well over the last, like I said, 6-7 years now. So that is a growth rate in this bed, but remember I had 10 to start with. 1 I gave away, I think 1 got basal canker, but that leaves another 4 in the garden, so I'll show you those because they've been planted in different conditions, in different aspects in the garden. We can compare the growth rate on those. So this is another 2 of those palm trees, and as we can see, they're roughly the same sort of height. So we're talking about from the ground to the top of the leaves, about 150, maybe a little higher on this one here to the right, but the trunks are the same sort of size, so about 60 centimetres tall. But these 2, they've sort of grown a bit more in shade to begin with, and actually the trunks are quite a lot thinner, so they've sort of been drawn upwards a bit, and they're not as chunky as the ones that have grown in a bit more sun further down the garden. So there's a bit of a difference there, and again these were planted at the same time, and they were, you know, they were the same size, same age plants. So these were grown from seed obviously originally, and I got these about 10 years ago now. So these are probably about 11-12 years from seed, and these 2 were in pots a bit longer than the ones further down the garden. So these have been planted out about 5 years now, and in that time they've gone from small plants to decent sized plants that, you know, can deal with any amount of cold weather. And over the next few years I expect them to grow much quicker now they've established and got to this sort of size where they start going upwards rather than outwards. And this is the final Trachycarpus princeps hybrid that was planted out before the others further down the garden that we just looked at. And this one was planted along the fence line, along with every other species of Trachycarpus that I do my regular yearly update videos on. This one gets maximum light, it gets decent amount of water as well, and it's grown really fast. The fastest growing Trachycarpus I have in the garden. It's faster than every type, other form and every species. And this is grown about, this is about 1 metre 30, 1 metre 40 of trunk, and that's done that in the last 7 years. So it's grown really quickly from a very small plant. Remember, this was the same size as all the other hybrids that I've shown you earlier in the video. So it does show positioning can make a huge difference, and competition as well from other plants. And the leaves on this are absolutely, well, they're phenomenally huge. They're the biggest leaves of any Trachycarpus I've got in the garden, and it's continuing to grow through winter, well into spring now, and it's continuing to grow and making a huge plant in this part of the garden. And we'll compare that to the glacial speed of growth on this Trachycarpus. This is Trachycarpus Gemini sectus, which is pretty much the slowest growing Trachycarpus species. It's nice and healthy. Look at these nice green leaves we've got even after winter. But it grows like 1.5 leaves a year. It keeps the leaves for many years, thankfully, so it's got a nice head of leaves on this. It's just so slow. This gets maximum sun as well, so it just gets all the best conditions. Beautiful white underneath the new leaves, so nice, interesting, very small growing, slow growing palm tree. And this just shows the difference between the different species of Trachycarpus. Some grow very quick, like the hybrids and the fortunei, and some, like the Gemini sectus and the nanas, grow extremely slowly. So that is a difference between them. Now this here is a Butia odorata, and this was planted in this bed at the same time as pretty much all of the plants, and that was about 7 years ago now. And it was planted from sort of a 10-litre tub, and it was planted out, so it was quite a small plant, and it only had a trunk. Well, it didn't really have a trunk, it had a base sort of big as my double fist like that. And you can see the size difference now. It's got a pretty sturdy trunk going on here, so it's nice and wide. It's a good sort of 30-40 centimeters wide, and it's not got much vertical trunk now compared to like Trachycarpus fortunei that grows very tall, but it's still, I would say, a good 30-40 centimeters before you get to this point, and then you get the leaves coming out. And the growth point is actually a bit higher up here, which is about 60 centimeters from the ground now. And the leaves are really big. I cut them back quite a lot here so they're not over the path, but the newest leaves at the top, they're big arching, you know, really durable green leaves. And it's very happy and healthy in this location. Again, this has got full sun, it's got a bit of protection from the hedges over there, and it's growing really, really well. It's getting competed a little bit with all these tetrapanax pups that I will dig up and remove that are growing around it, but other than that, it's growing extremely well in this location, and it's grown pretty fast. So you don't need a huge plant to start with to get this sort of impact, but like I said, I've waited sort of, you know, 5, 6, 7 years to get a decent sized substantial plant like this. And I bought another one a similar size to this and planted out at this sort of size, and I'll show you that one now. So here's another Butia odorata, and like I said, this is actually now no bigger really than the one that was much smaller when it's planted out. And what I want to show in this example is the fact that we've got two Butias that are planted no more than 10 meters apart, but they were planted at different sizes, but yet over the course of about 4 or 5 years in this case, they've got to be the same sort of size. So we had the Butia over there, like I said, no bigger than my fist together when it was planted out 7 years ago. This one hasn't really grown any bigger in the 5 years it's been planted. So this trunk that you see here, this is how big it was 5 years ago. And the reason it's not grown as quickly as the other one is the smaller plant has got established really well, got its roots down before it started putting on its growth, and it was a smaller plant, so it was easy to adjust from being in a pot to being in the ground. Whereas this big Butia, it was probably grown in the field originally, dug up and then kept in a pot for a year or so before it was sold. I bought it as a potted specimen. It had a good root system on it, really good healthy root system, planted out here, and it's similar sort of conditions. Yes, it may be a little bit more shady here than over there, but basically it's the same conditions, and it's had not too much competing around it. Yes, over the last 2 years we've got loads of these bamboo seedlings appeared, but apart from that, you know, the reason it's not grown as quickly as the other one is because this was bigger to begin with, and big palms planted out don't always just romp away. They can sit there for a while or slowly grow. It is better to grow from a small plant to get really good growth rather than a big plant. But then there is a balance you've got to make between the cost and how much impact you want straight away. If you want a big impact straight away, go for the big plants. But over time, the smaller planted out specimens will probably do better than the bigger planted specimens because they've had more time to get into your soil and grow in those conditions while small, and then acclimatise and basically do better over the long term. Whereas a big specimen, yes, this looked great straight away, and it still looks great now, but it's not growing as fast or as vigorous as my other specimen. Here we have what's known as a slow growing palm, and that is Brahea armata, the Mexican fan palm. And as you can see, it's actually got quite a substantial trunk on this now, and this was planted out 7 years ago, and it's planted in pure grit, and we've done a video on this so you can see back to how I planted this out and, you know, what sort of soil was like before this was planted. So I'll do a link to that video in the description below. But you can see now it's got quite a sturdy trunk. This was planted out with a small trunk, tapering trunk, sort of this sort of size, so no wider than sort of like 7-8 centimetres at the top, going out to probably about 10-15 centimetres. Now it's a good sort of 25-30 centimetres across at the base, and the trunk itself is about a good 50 centimetres, maybe 60 centimetres tall before we get to the top where all the leaves are coming out. And it grows between 5 to 8 leaves a year normally, and it's nice and sturdy. When this was first planted out, it was very wobbly. It had roots well on one side of the basal plate, but not roots on the other side. So it's a bit wobbly, and I firmed it up with some rocks, and it's rooted in all directions now, so it's nice and firm. And this grows really well. Like I said, 5 to 8 leaves a year is not much slower than Trachycarpus fortunei, but it's not growing with such vigour in terms of height. It's sort of going out, and overall it's just, for whatever reason, it doesn't put on much height compared to Trachycarpus fortunei, even though the growth rate in terms of leaves is not that dissimilar really in my location. It's got full sun, you can see the beautiful blue silver leaves in the sunlight. Really happy in my location, we've got no spotting on the leaves or anything like that, and it grows really early on in the year. I'm filming this in April and we've already had a full leaf out already, so it's very happy in this location. But yes, it's a very slow growing palm. So this might be one you want to buy a big specimen of to plant out if you want that instant impact, because if you plant it small, you've got to wait a long time. But I was happy to plant this out from a pot. I've had this palm for about 13 years now. It was in a pot for a few years before it's planted out, and the roots were fantastic on it. You have to be careful with Brahea armata. Never tease away the roots or break them, because they can basically bleed and it really hinders the growth, and it can actually kill a plant if you break too many of its roots. So this was carefully planted out here, and it's really thrived in this location. But overall, it's a slow growing palm, but I think it's well worth growing in the UK. Now, you probably can't see in the picture very well what I'm looking at, and that is 2 small palm trees. We've got this regular Trachycarpus fortunei, or it could be a fortunei cross with Rhineranus, and this was grown from seed by myself. And down here we have a palm tree that doesn't look great. The leaves are a little bit yellow, they've got a bit of spotting, and this is a Jubea cross with a Butia F1 hybrid. It's nice and sturdy in the ground. Yes, we've got some leaf litter from the hedge that I've cut around here, but it's sturdy in the ground, and it's very small. So this plant you probably think is very young, maybe sort of 2-3 years old. In fact, this I believe is 11 years old. So I've had this for 10 years, and it was just a seedling. It was one strap leaf seedling, and it kept in a pot for about 6, 7, 8 years, and then I planted it out 3 or 4 years ago as still a very small plant. I've kept another one potted, and it's not done much. It's grown a cup, like a leaf a year, and it's still extremely small, but it's not dying. It's, you know, slowly chipping away, and this shows you what can happen when you've got a small plant in the ground. If you start with a small palm tree, not a Trachycarpus fortunei, but if you've something a bit rarer, something like the Butias or this Jubea, it's really small and it just takes ages and ages to get any bulk. Whereas this Trachycarpus fortunei, this was grown from seed, again quite a while ago now, so this is actually 6-7 years old from seed, and it's still much healthier, much bigger than the Jubea Butia cross here. Obviously they're very close together. One of these will get moved soon, and this is actually pretty slow growing at this size, but once they get bigger they'll grow much quicker and taller, like the other specimens that I've shown you earlier in the video. So this is a Chimerops or Camerops humilis, the European fan palm, and it's quite high contrast where I'm filming this, but this stands now at basically 6 foot tall to the top of the leaves, and we've got a trunk that's about a good metre tall, and it's nice and stout. This normally grows as a clump forming palm tree with lots of different side shoots, but this hasn't produced too many side shoots, and I continually chop them off at the base, and all the energy is gone into this main trunk. It's in full sun in this gravel bed here, and this has grown very strongly and very quickly compared to the ones that have been in pots. So I had 2 in pots that I've had for over 10 years. They're still in the original pots that I planted them out into, and they are not much bigger than when I got them 10 years ago. This one, it was a similar size to the one that is still in a pot now. So you'll see this one, and then you'll see the one in the pots in a second, and you'll see the difference in size. And it shows you that planting them out makes a huge difference to the growth of the European fan palm. So like I said, big chunky trunk on this one, loads of sort of old fruits. That's what these are from the last few years. I've not cut off. Loads and loads of leaves, easily 10-15 leaves a year on this, and it's got a decent sized trunk. But this one, again, this has been planted out I think 6-7 years, and it's grown probably about a foot or maybe foot and a half, 60 centimeters, maybe 50-60 centimeters. So it's grown pretty strongly in this location because it's got its roots down through the gravel into the soil, and it's very happy here. So it's great that you got to this part of the video. So far I've seen lots of different palm trees and how they've grown in my garden over the last 10 years or so, some planted out and some in pots. And really what I want you to take away from this is basically some types of palm tree grow much faster than others. So the fortunei and the princeps hybrids grow really quickly, whereas some things like the Trachycarpus, Gemini sectus and the European fan palm Chilensis humilis grow much slower, and same with the Brahea armata as well. And also where you situate your palm tree makes a huge difference on its growth rate, because we've seen fortunei grow really tall, over 2.5 meters, and we've seen some that were planted at the same time, albeit a bit smaller, that are still like 20-30 centimeters because of where they were positioned in the garden. So positioning makes a massive difference, species makes a massive difference, how you feed them as well can make a big difference in the growth rate in the summer, and whether or not it's potted or not. So we've seen the chilensis in a pot, we've seen the chilensis in the ground that were both roughly the same sort of size, and you can see the one in the ground has grown much bigger than the one in the pot. And this applies for pretty much all other types of palm tree as well. Grow it in a pot, you know, it will restrict the growth of a palm tree. Put it in the ground and it'll get its roots down and it'll grow to its maximum potential. So hopefully you found this video interesting and informative. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. Click the bell icon below and subscribe so you always see my latest videos pop up on your feed. And join me next week where I'll be doing more in the garden. Thank you for watching this edition of Exotic Gardener UK. Join me next week where we'll be doing more in the garden.